bit slow. All right. Very good. Okay, we're all set up. I'd just like to confirm for myself that it is in fact there before I get started. Okay, so welcome back everybody to the last three talks of the evening, or the late morning, or the early afternoon, whatever it is where you are. So our next talk is by Professor Kwok Kui Wong, who received his PhD from Tübingen. He's associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. So another presenter from Hong Kong. He has interest in Nietzsche and Schelling, hermeneutics. He's interested in themes such as time, poetics, and theater aesthetics. And today, his talk is entitled Schelling and Nietzsche on Dionysus. So without further ado, please.
Thank you, great. Thank you. First, thank you for organizing this conference. My paper is really a comparison between Schelling's and Nietzsche's reception of Dionysus. And as you will see, the focus is more on Schelling, and Nietzsche is much more like a counterpart, is for the sake of comparison. So I just read my paper. It is a well-known fact that the Apollo-Dionysus duality was not invented by Nietzsche, but has been discussed one way or another much earlier by Winckelmann, Hölderlin, Schlegel, Müller, Kreuzer, Bachhofen, Schelling, etc. This long list of names also testifies at the same time that the history of this reception of the Greek god by German philosophers, archaeologists, philologists, etc. And there are a few things we may note. First, among the predecessors, the first one was Winckelmann. He was an art historian who looked at the issue from the perspective of plastic art, sculpture in particular, which is bound to be calmer in its expression, or what Winckelmann famously puts it, noble simplicity and serene greatness, as compared to the often violent nature of myth and tragedy. It can also be supplemented by Lessing's famous comparison between sculpture and poetry is lacune, as the former is tends less to express violent emotion than poetry does. This is therefore no wonder that Winckelmann looks at both Apollo and Dionysus as two ideal types of Greek beauty. While his Dionysus is a classical one, homoerotic symbol of double-sex beauty. I'm quoting a scholar, Barbara von Leibniz, ein Kommentar zu Nietzsches Die Geburt der Tragödie. It's a very useful reference for anyone who studies Nietzsche's book. And has therefore not represented Dionysus as the wild, ecstatic, intoxicating god, and that's not an opposite to Apollo, but similar representations of young, beautiful men. The transformation of Dionysus' image comes about because of two factors. The first is what has been called the new mythologies championed by the Romantics, such as Schlegel and Schelling. As Manfred Frank has noted, it was indeed the idea of a dark, non-classical, non-Olympic, and non-Homeric god first dawns at the Romantics, unquote. This romantic turn has also made possible by the discoveries of archaeologists and philologists such as Kreuzer, Müller, Bachhofen. Among these, Kreuzer's work, Symbolik und Mythologie der alten Völker, besonders der Griechen, has been the source of both Schelling's philosophy of mythology, philosophy of revelation, and also Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. The influence of Kreuzer is twofold. First, his theory of symbol based on the distinction between symbol and myth, and second, his analysis of Dionysius ecstatic cult. And my paper will be more focused on the first point as a preparation for the comparison between Schelling and Nietzsche. So, symbol and myth. Kreuzer's distinction between symbol and myth is based on a quotation from Proclus, Plato's Theology. I just quote the first sentence. Quote, for those who treat divine concerns in an indicative manner, either speak symbolically and fabulously or through images. This paragraph not only tells us about the different practices of the Greek religions, but it has also an obvious philosophical significance. As Kreuzer has pointed out, the Greek word Eindesis is translated into German as undeutend or intuitive, means veiled or verhüllt, or is against unveiled or unverhüllt. And it speaks either to the ears as mythos or the eyes as symbols, symbol. The priest, for example, represents the message from God through revelation, not development and concepts. Not by Offenbarung, nicht Begriffsentwicklung. Therefore, in a manner reminiscent of Cusanus or even Plato, Kreuzer points out the picture and images of symbols are given to us like vision in an instant, whereas discourse, account, logos, epos are linguistic unwrapping or unfolding of this intuitive idea. Symbol, however, is an attempt to express the infinite through the finite. It is because the human soul sways between the world of ideas and the world of senses. Therefore, between infinite and finite, symbols are therefore the momentary, famously says, the total, the unfathomable in its origin, the necessary. Myth, on the other hand, is discourse, the Rede, an expression of thought through logos, epos, etc. The significance of Kreuzer's distinction is very obvious in Schelling's understandings of mythology and revelation. The former is a story, a narrative account or origin of things through genealogy of gods from Egyptian Ares, Isis, Osiris to the Greek gods, etc. Chaos, Kronos, Uranus, and Demeter and Dionysus. The latter reflects the divine will and freedom of one single God who knows no chronology. Schelling adheres closely to his own theory of three potencies in his account. Sein Können is the material cause, from Gaia, chaos, Gaia to Demeter. Sein Wollen, as from Zeus, Zagreus, and Dionysus. And finally, Sein Sollen. Schelling, taking inspiration from Kreuzer, identifies the three sides of Dionysus himself. First, the wild, ecstatic Dionysus Zagreus. Second, the god of wine and joy, who has overcome Zagreus and become the Bacchus. And third, the spiritualized mystery of Iacchus. Moreover, Schelling relies heavily on Hesiod, whose theogony can serve perfectly the purpose of Schelling's theogonic project. We will see later that the philosophical significance of Kreuzer's notion of symbol in our discussion of Schelling's ecstasy of reason. Nietzsche, on the other hand, rarely mentions Hesiod in The Birth of Tragedy, nor is he interested in any theogonic account of the Greek gods. Though there is no doubt about Homer's significance in Nietzsche's early writings, Homer is not used in The Birth of Tragedy, as far as the mythological account is concerned, nor does Dionysus have any presence in Homer's two epics. Nietzsche's Dionysus is not an Olympian god, but of mysterious origin, and it is by nature of his status that he has become the opposite of Apollo. Moreover, Dionysus is for Nietzsche not only one of many gods in the Greek polytheism and mythological account, but one of two cosmic forces, that is the force of destruction, frenzy, drunkenness, and creativity. Nietzsche's aesthetic notion of Dionysus is obviously impressed by Kreuzer's account of God in Book 3. While Schelling also talks about drunkenness in ecstasy in the philosophy of revelation. and has explicitly related it to Dionysus. So what we are doing in the following is to take a closer look at Schelling's discussion. Schelling's most explicit discussion about Apollo-Dionysus duality is found in his philosophy of revelation, which is strikingly similar to Nietzsche's description of the two gods. I'm quoting Schelling in an English translation. Each work of the spirit shows even the sensible knower whether it arose from a harmonious balance of those activities, or whether one of the two, and which was the dominant one. There is the preponderance of productive activity where the form appears too weak compared to the content. The content partially overwhelms the form. The opposite occurs when the form suppresses the content and the work lacks fullness. To be drunk, this is the key sentence. To be drunk and sober at the same time, not at different moments, but at the same time, is the secret of true poetry. I repeat, this has often been quoted. To be drunk and sober at the same time, not different moments, but at the same time, is the secret of true poetry. This distinguishes Apollonian enthusiasm from the merely Dionysian. An infinite content, that is, a content that actually resists form, seems to annihilate every form to represent such an infinite content in the most perfect, that is, in the most finite form. That is the highest task in art, unquote. Schelling's argument above clearly echoes Kreuzer's distinction between mythology and revelation. The former is necessary, causally connected, theogonic process, as Schelling's answer the question, why there is something rather than nothing, by giving an account of the creation according to three potencies. So much is the story of polytheism. But when it comes to monotheism or the philosophy of revelation, it cannot be explained by the law of necessity, but must be understood as an act of freedom. For God is beyond laws of necessity he has created, nor is his action explainable by laws of succession and causality. It is an act of absolute freedom which is preceded by no cause, nor is it chronologically ordered, but is entirely spontaneous, coming from the abyss at any time and no time, and can be repeated anytime, but with each repetition, it can be different because it is free. However, though in the passage above, Schelling juxtaposes these two opposites, it has yet to be remarked that these juxtapositions of producing hindering forces or Dionysus, Apollo, are not direct parallels to symbol or myth. The picture is quite a bit more complicated. The idea of a free and spontaneous action of the absolute consciousness can be traced back to as early as Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, or to later the Weltalter. The key element here is time, for time is the basis for chronology of theogony, whereas revelation is timeless. In his system, Schelling distinguishes between empirical and absolute consciousness. The series of succession of causality is nothing else but the evolution of the original absolute synthesis. Therefore, time begins anew with each empirical consciousness, and therefore has no beginning for the empirical consciousness except from absolute freedom. The empirical consciousness, which is caught in the succession, strived in each moment of its free action to represent the original synthesis, or as in a Weltalter, Schelling develops this idea further, that each thing has its own inner and inborn time, which begins in each thing anew from eternity. Therefore, the distinction between myth and revelation are not only about the two different forms of God's epiphany, but two fundamental principles of the world. While we are in the chain of causality, it is only because of our imitation of the absolute consciousness that we have freedom. Further, in his introduction to philosophy of revelation, Schelling argues that there are two possible ways to construct positive philosophy as against Hegel's negative philosophy. First, either by beginning from the world of sensibility and individual existences. Yet reason, as Schelling famously argues, cannot prove the existence of the individual objects like this plant or that stone. And even if it can prove that there is a net of reason, it cannot explain how this world of senses enter into this net. Moreover, relying on individual sensible things to answer the question of why there is something rather than nothing means that reason is submitting itself to the authority of senses, which becomes no longer reason but faith. The other way is to look for the highest idea, which is reasonable and exists necessarily at the same time. This idea is the highest God. Thus, Schelling comes to the ontological argument for the existence of God. There are two possibilities of the ontological argument. Either the existence of something is deduced from this concept, or the concept of something is deduced from its existence. Positive philosophy should take the first route, for the latter is representation or Vorstellung rather than thinking or denken. The primal idea is, however, beyond the realm of reasons, so that Schelling turns the duality of reason and unreason and speaks of the ecstasy of reason in revelation, philosophy of revelation. What is merely being is being, in which I'm quoting from Schelling. What is merely being is being, in which rather all ideas, all potency is excluded. We should therefore only be able to call it this reverse idea, the idea in which reason is placed outside of itself. Reason can possess that which is, in which there is still nothing of a concept of what is only as the absolute outside itself. Reason is therefore posited outside itself in the positing, absolute ecstatic. This is quote, end of quote. As we know, Nietzsche's Dionysus is also the god of ecstasy, of out of himself, außer sich sein, the Greek word ecstasis, which Schelling's ecstasy of reason means also reason going out of itself. There are therefore more points of comparison between the two philosophers around this idea. So the next section will be on ecstasy of reason. Yet the idea of ecstasy of reason was raised by Schelling not first in the philosophy of revelation, but earlier in Erlangen-Vorlesung, where he talks about it in more detail. There are many obvious parallels between Schelling's Erlanger-Vorlesungen and his other writings like A System and Weltalter and Philosophy of Revelation. But the most interesting for us is that in his Erlanger-Vorlesung, Schelling raises the paradox of reason. I quote the German. Die Vernunft aber kann ewig nur Vernunft sein. Sie kann sich nicht zu einem anderen von sich oder gar zu ihrem Gegenteil machen. Unquote. As much as consciousness cannot make itself unconscious in order to understand unconsciousness, neither can reason make it irrational by reason, by means of reason, in order to understand the irrational. For any deliberate act of irrationality by the rational can not get away from its own consciousness that it is being irrational. As Schelling says, nur der Starke kann oder darf schwach sein. As long as it knows that it is being irrational, it is actually irrational. For as much as real madness does not know that it is mad, so true irrationality believes that it is rational. God's madness or irrationality, however, is not lower but higher than human irrationality. So God can be rational and irrational as he chooses freely because of his genius. This is the basis of God's rational, irrational potencies. This obviously echoes with Schelling's idea of drunkenness and sobriety At the same time, in his philosophy of revelation. So I quote from Schelling again, from his philosophy of revelation. Yes, not only in God, even in man, insofar as he is bestowed with a ray of creative power, do we find the same relationship, the same contradiction, a bond by his nature, limitless productive power, the one prudent, resisting informing it, that is peculiar negating force in the same subject, and in the same subject, yes, unquote. What is of particular importance is, however, Schelling's discussion of the relation between individual consciousness and their primal unity we have seen in the system of transcendental idealism, that the former has to go out of itself, ecstasis, and immerse itself into a much bigger unity in order to experience or even understand it. But how is it possible? Schelling talks again about the paradox of eternal freedom. If one wants to make freedom its own object, Gegenstand, yet the moment one tries to grasp it, it either becomes no longer free or escapes from him. There is therefore a rotatory movement in which man constantly searches for freedom, but it always escapes him. The elusive nature of freedom means that it has to be reached negatively, relying on Plato's idea of divine madness, mania, and the idea of the soul as a constantly spinning circle. The individual subject is thrown here and fro between the center of the absolute subject and the periphery of the absolute ignorance, absolutes Nichtwissen. In a version reminiscent of Cusanus, Dr. Ignorantia, Schelling argues that the subject will go through three stages. First, absolute inwardness, which is entirely ignorant about the world outside. Second, it goes over to the object so that the subject and the object are in relation of reversed mirror reflection. And then third, it returns to the subject in that this knowledge dies out and becomes ignorance. Yet this is not the same simple ignorance as the first stage. The third is not a simple, not the same as the first, but is, as Schelling calls, knowing ignorance, wissendes Nichtwissen, that it remembers its experience of absolute freedom in the second stage by making this freedom inward, verinnerlicht. Schelling's three stages, of course, resemble Hegel's many ideas and even the structure of phenomenology of spirit, such as his discussion of sense certainty, etc. What interests us, however, are 2 points. First, this movement or dialectic between the individual consciousness and the originary unity is also very much present in Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. For example, the latest discussion of the Apollonian Principium Individuationis, the idea of naive artists tapping into his own inwardness so that when he expresses his very subjective emotion, he is actually expressing the Schopenhauerian universal will. And then the Dionysian transformation in the satyr chorus, where the artist sees, quote from Nietzsche, lively visions hovering in front of his eyes so that he wants to enter into them, unquote. And finally, quote, man is no longer an artist, but a work of art itself, unquote. Therefore, aside from these similarities in the idealistic flavor, what Nietzsche has, but Schelling lacks in his real work is the real work of art, namely the Greek tragedy, especially the experience of satyr chorus as the basis of ecstasy. Moreover, Schelling could have come very much closer to Nietzsche had he chosen to illustrate his theory with an example of Greek tragedy. For example, for Schelling, the three stages pose very interesting parallels to Euripides' Bacchae. First, Pantheos' stubborn refusal to recognize Dionysus, and second, his curiosity about the latter, which drives him to watch the revel secretly, but is torn into pieces by his mother Agave, who mistakes him to be a lion. And third, Agave returns to Thebes and gradually remembers that the lion is actually her own son, thus demonstrating the horrible power of divine Dionysus, or in a word, the destruction of the individual. There are therefore systematic similarities and differences between the philosophical underpinnings of Schelling's and Nietzsche's reception of Dionysus. For example, both of them rely on a certain primal unity in their systems. Schelling's on an absolute, and Nietzsche on the Schopenhauerian Ureinen. Yet these two primal unities are also fundamentally different. While Schelling's absolute is the resolution of all contradictions, a perfect state of consciousness and knowledge, identity of subject and object, Nietzsche's Ureinen is essentially a Schopenhauerian chaos, which defies all reasonable understanding, the world of representation, or the principles of sufficient reason. So this is the final page. However, the most important difference is, in my view, is that Schelling's ecstasy of reason is philosophically deduced. It is a philosophical possibility. It is often made visible via negativa, by making use of concepts such as freedom and spontaneity, which also often have to be understood via negativa. Schelling is looking or peeping into this irrationality from the outside, from its periphery, on the basis of reason. Nietzsche's Dionysus, on the other hand, is to put it in German, mittendrin dem Wahnsinn statt nur dabei. His resolution of the paradox of irrationality is made possible not by philosophical deduction, but by a real cultural product, namely the rausch, the intoxication associated with Greek tragedy, the blood ritual, the spragmos, satire chorus, and etc. Ironically, Schelling's idea of drunkenness and sobriety at the same time has been, if not realized, at least witnessed in Nietzsche's later philosophical career, particularly, of course, his later works such as Zarathustra. This may has to be attributed to Nietzsche's own biography, his mental problems, etc. But a key factor is that Nietzsche, rather than merely regarding Dionysus as one of many gods in Greek theogony, has made use of this god to develop his new method of philosophizing. Because in my personal view, one of Nietzsche's greatest contributions to Western philosophy is that he has subverted the opposition between emotion and thinking. Since Socrates up to Kant, the mainstream belief has been that emotion is a hindrance to rational thinking. That one has to be cool and calm and eradicate all irrational emotions in order to think logically and clearly. Nietzsche's Dionysus has, however, demonstrated the contrary, that the more heightened one's emotion is, the better and clearer one can think. Schelling's idea of drunkenness and sobriety at the same time is an idea, a suggestion, while Nietzsche has embodied this idea in his own and shown how it really works. So finally, I just give a very personal note to this issue. Finally, as a playwright and theater practitioner myself, there is a personal question which I have been asking for a long time. Had Nietzsche ever seen a Greek tragedy performed on stage? Did he ever get, or did he ever get all these ideas about Dionysus in tragedy just by reading books? Or was he inspired by any live performance? This is an important question because as Kanchik, a Tübinger philologist, has pointed out that Nietzsche and other contemporary philologists such as Wilhelmovich Moellendorff regarded Greek tragedy in ancient times not merely as a literary text, quote, for the quiet hours of a lonely reader, unquote, but as lively religious and collective rituals. It is therefore unimaginable that Nietzsche himself merely had bookish experiences about the most important art form for him. However, we have very detailed, while we have very detailed records about Nietzsche's visits to concerts and Wagner's operas, we have no clue about him going to theater, see Greek tragedy performed. Moreover, another interesting question is, even if he had seen any Greek tragedy performed in 19th century Germany or Europe, for that matter, what style of performance was it? This is because from my personal experience of watching these performances in Germany and Europe. Did it involve any sort of Dionysian elements like masks, live music, dance, chorus, etc.? For in my personal experience of watching Greek tragedy in Germany, I was in Germany in 1997 to 2001. Of course, I have not watched all the performances, but from those I've seen, the majority of them are not Dionysian, in my opinion. The texts are always spoken. There was no musical accompaniment, no mask, no dance. And even if they do have a dance, have a chorus, the lines of the chorus are also merely spoken rather than chanted. There is no rausch, no ecstasy, no combination of drunkenness and sobriety, no Dionysus, but Apollonian sobriety through and through, as if one is reading a philosophical text. Whether it was also the case for the 19th century German theater is a question for theater historians. I have no idea. I haven't started researching this topic yet. So I have no clue about these questions and therefore welcome any suggestions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. So we have, Martijn, I may be mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry, but you're up first.
Thank you very much. That's the important thing. I'd happily have my name trampled as long as I get to the front of the queue. That is what life is about.
You're at the front.
Thank you very much for this lovely presentation. I can never hear enough about late Schelling, so I'm happy to see that we have so many interesting talks in this field. But it seems that your insistence, let me lay this out carefully. You sketch the most important difference between Schelling on the one hand and Nietzsche on the other, as in the fact that Nietzsche has a positive, creative concept of art connected to Dionysus, whereas this is lacking in the case of Schelling. And along the lines of some of the things that Jesper said earlier today in reaction to Stefan's keynote, I just wanted to remind us together, and then see what we do with this, that it's not accidental that the late Schelling, when he writes his philosophy of mythology, is not presenting a philosophy of art. After all, he is explicitly distantiating himself from the idea that mythology is art or is artistic. And he has reasons for this. Why? Because the philosophy of mythology is supposed to address the deepest stratum of religious consciousness, and therefore explicitly not the artistic shaping of mythological material, which already represents a form of distancing oneself from the immediacy of the mythologically given. So the crucial bit about mythology for Schelling is that we are caught in it. We are not free over and against it. Whereas already Homer is able to treat the gods with humor even, right? In depicting them, the artistic consciousness creates a distance from the immediacy of religious consciousness to a sphere that is already, in a sense, more enlightened, more free, and in this sense, also, perhaps one could make the argument, proto-philosophical, right? That, like philosophy, art distances itself from the mythologically given. Now, then the question, of course, is this a bad thing, as you say, or is it a good thing? And I think that's very much an open question that we can talk about here. But I think it's salutary in Schelling's late analysis that he doesn't simply conflate mythology with art. And therefore, he also presents an obstacle to all those thinkers in modernity, from, shall we say, Nietzsche all the way through Stefan, who see a happy and immediate and unproblematic marriage between the idea of the mythological on the one hand and aesthetic expression on the other. So, yes, what can you say about this aesthetic shape of mythology and the way you believe that this is a necessary element in Nietzsche that we are missing in Schelling?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question. Perhaps if I have a longer passage to paper, I may have done a bit more contextualization of Schelling's and Nietzsche's reception of Dionysus. You're right that the later Schelling's primal concern is mythology, is answering with questions about myth and about being absolute. Whereas his focus is less on art. He's interested in art more in his earlier works, such as System of Transcendental Idealism. Whereas for Nietzsche, art is really for him the main thing is he was not interested in mythological accounts like as I said in my paper, Hesiod. Even there was no account of birth or genesis of Dionysus. There may be some suggestions that Dionysus came from Babylon or some very wild origin, but he was not very interested indeed in this, like what Schelling has done in philosophy of mythology, that giving account of all these gods and then giving philosophical interpretation. Therefore, my conclusion that the different receptions of Dionysus between Schelling and Nietzsche is also determined by this contextualization, that one is more interested in art and the other is more interested in mythology. So if we are, it's hard to say whether it's a good thing or bad thing, but I would say that if we want to have a more balanced and more comprehensive comparison between Schelling and Nietzsche, we may have to put them in the context of how they see art on the one hand and how they see myth on the other, and put this perspective into the comparison, which is of course a big piece of work because it's, throughout different stages, Schelling has different takes about art and mythology. So, but your question is valid. I think about again that perhaps my conclusion is pushing it a bit far, but the point is if we remark that their reception is determined by the contextualization, then that makes perhaps more sense. Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question and the answer. We have a couple more questions, so I'll just move on here to Fernando Wirtz.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. I'm also very grateful that you mentioned Kreuzer, because I'm also interested in Kreuzer. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned 2 points that were important for Schelling about Kreuzer. You mentioned first the distinction between myth and symbol, and you said that there is also the singular interpretation of Kreuzer about Dionysus. So I wonder what is for you the important element that Schelling took from Kreuzer about Dionysus, because there is also this passage where Schelling says Kreuzer is maybe one of the first persons who rehabilitate the figure of Dionysus, that is in Philosophy of Revelation, I think. So that will be my first question. And the second one is related to this. You also mentioned in Schelling the concept of Wahnsinn, of madness. That is very important for Schelling. He mentions this already in the Stuttgarter Privatvorlesungen. And then again in Philosophy of Revelation, in the Weltalter. But still, when it appears in relation to Dionysus, the concept of madness seems to be associated with this second figure of Dionysus, that is Bacchus, right? So yeah, I wonder how you localize the role of madness in the Philosophy of Revelation, taking into account that for Nietzsche, the madness and Dionysus is an elemental character of Dionysus. But in Schelling, it doesn't seem to me so clear that it's how far can we see a really rehabilitation of madness in Schelling? Even if Schelling has a very strong defense of madness, he says there is no creation without madness. Right? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm perhaps under the second question first. In my presentation, Wahnsinn or ecstasy is. I still think Schelling is moving along the Platonic tradition, that Wahnsinn is good as long as it's divine Wahnsinn, divinely inspired madness. And it's not something what we call about today is madness in the clinical sense, or what Nietzsche is talking about. So it's a very safe, protected by God, absolute, immersing oneself in the absolute, the ocean of absolute, well, recognizing our own limitation, our finiteness, and this divine madness, right? And it's and his account of Greek mythologies is very much a pathway through different stages of human created madness to the divine madness. This is echoing between his ecstasy of reason is Stuttgarter Privatvorlesung, as you have mentioned, and Erlanger Vorlesung, and also Philosophy of Revelation, that he is still moving along the realm of divine madness, not pure madness. Whereas Nietzsche is really very much a very wild madness, really scary thing, which is pagan, which is although inspired by a god, is Dionysus, not the absolute God. So it's very dangerous. So if you relocate that with, for example, Euripides, Bacchae, this is something we scare. We are on the one hand curious, but on the other hand, was attracted to it. So it's, if we really want to give a more comprehensive comparison between the two, we may have to have a conceptual differentiation of different sorts of madness, divine madness, inspired by God, and what God, or simply loss of reason or rationality, clinical madness. So it's, Schelling is more to that, and Nietzsche is to the other. So it's quite, although there are similarities between them in terms of ecstasy, but there is huge difference between them in that sense. as far as the first question, Kreuzer, thank you for mentioning that. As I said in our paper, there are 2 points of importance for Schelling, Kreuzer's work. One is, of course, the symbol, the distinction between symbol and myth. The other is the account of Dionysus, his birth, his genesis, his overcoming, and his relation with the 3 potencies of relation with Zagreus and Iacchus and etc. So I think there's something we can do to put these together, because for Kreuzer, they may not be two different separate things. I have to look further again into Bach and Kreuzer. But my impressions is that they are not, perhaps not different things, but they can put together in a way, I'm not sure, and I'm now speculating only, in a way that there is a gradual process of developing from myth to symbol as a parallel to his entire project of developing from philosophy of mythology to philosophy of revelation. That Dionysus is first, you see, from the 3 stages. First is his birth, his story, and then it's myth. But the other thing is religion, is epiphany, is revelation, right? Dionysus can also reveal itself in religious rituals and religious and tragedy, etc. So we can draw an interesting parallel if we are to compare Kreuzer's work to Schelling, at least from the perspective of Schelling, his reception of Kreuzer, this gradual development from mythological accounts to divine revelation. That's my initial idea, but perhaps I have to look into that more in detail. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Briefly, Jesper, and then try to take a 5-minute break. Okay.
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for your talk also. It made me think, and also brought me back to the first talk by Stefan. And the difference, you said the difference in their views upon arts also has implications for the difference in mythology. So you said the concept of art there in the center. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the following, because there's another dimension to mythology, and maybe even also to art, a dimension, namely that these discussions are deeply embedded in, they try to grapple with the theory of time and historicity. So, so this is another dimension to it that maybe foreshadows the discussions on mythology and art. I'm only probing here. For example, can we have a new Shakespeare? Can we write tragedies again? And so on and so forth. This is also a shared object of discussion. So, and I think this is really interesting also because the answer to these questions were interesting to them, at least around 1800, insofar as they said something about contemporary times. So what times are we living in, right? And the answer to the question, if there could be new arts and if there could be a new mythology, would then have implications for what times we were living in and the historicity and so on. And it seems to me that we may be, and this is what I want to ask you, that we maybe find here 2 different models. In 1800 model, of course, I'm a bit, I'm not that detailed here, but like an 1800 model where past is lost and the future is uncertain. And then we have a 1900 model with people like, maybe people like Nietzsche, this is my question, where the past is of course somehow not present, but it's not, you can access it. And we find these thoughts too in Heidegger and Gadamer, right? Because we have this Tradiertheit, that the past is present in the present. So the past is not that really, not that problematic as for the 1800. And I wanted to give you a quote that I also thought upon as I heard Stefan's talk. It's Husserl to Brentano, 1905, I think. Ganz ernst denkt eine Möglichkeit nur, aber nur derjenige durch, der an sie glaubt. So Husserl is saying that you can only think something true if you believe in it. And belief is here also maybe in the direction of faith, that you really need to take it upon you. But for Husserl, time, the past is no problem, because his theory of your time, right? Although time is elusive and hard to grasp, the past is present in the present, and the future too, in some sense. But what's your thought about this two model theory?
I'm not sure I can. Yeah, this of course. I agree that time has a significant role to play in Schelling. That's why I have devoted a section on Schelling's Weltalter, especially. And what you have talked about reminds me of something that is organic theory of time. I'm not thinking along the line of a different cultural perspective, or whether we are optimistic or pessimistic about the past, but because of Schelling's idea of organic theory of time is past and past, present. They are here in the present. Past and future are here in the present. Everything is gewesen somehow, and there's no chronology of time because time begins anew at every single moment. This is a very revolutionary idea of time as against the more mechanical theory of time. So I'm not sure I can. Your question is very interesting, but I'm not sure I can answer that by relating by relating Schelling's organic theory of time to this particular question, because no, I just have to think about it. Sorry, thank you. It's because and for me it's entirely two different concepts of time. So it's for example Husserl and Schelling. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
Okay, thanks everybody for the questions, and thank you, Kwokwe, for the paper and for.
Sorry, I can't answer his question. Jasper's question.
Well, I think as philosophers, we can't answer a lot of and most important questions. We can't answer. So, let's take a little break. We have 7-minute break, and we'll come back at 9 o'clock to hear more about Nietzsche and Dionysus. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. So we have 2 more talks this afternoon, or this evening, I guess, here in Hong Kong, 9 p.m. already. Our next talk is by Mengxi Chen, who is assistant professor of philosophy at the Chinese Culture University in Taiwan. And the title of the talk is Nietzsche and Mythological Metaphor on the Significance of the Allegory of Dionysus's Dismemberment in the Birth of Tragedy. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? It's okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. And thank you for Professor Moss for organizing this conference. And yeah, my introduction is short. No, I mean, yeah, but it's okay. I will just go quickly into my presentation. And it's a great opportunity to do a presentation after Dr. Huang. Yeah, and my presentation is sort of related to what Professor Huang just presented. Yeah, it's about Dionysus and also about ecstasy. But I would say that my paper is not directly dealing with mythology. Yeah, that's maybe that's the difference between the other excellent papers. But what I'm trying to do is to present how Nietzsche used this allegory of Dionysus' dismemberment in articulating the concept of ecstasy. So I'll just go directly to I have to try to share my paper. Is it clear? Also, yeah. Yeah, so the question I ask is not how Nietzsche talks about the significance of any mythology, but how he simply adopts or uses, maybe unconsciously, all these mythological figures, especially Dionysus, in articulating some very important concepts for him. Yeah, so I asked the question, how does Nietzsche use Dionysus as a mythical figure and his dismemberment, or sparagmos in Latin, to align the notion of ecstasy? Ecstasy is the literary meaning out of place. So my purpose is to justify mythological metaphor as a powerful philosophical language in Nietzsche's thought, as well as to show why the notion and praise of self-loath is so frequently articulated through a demand of bodily fermentation, as seen in some other Oriental myths, which echoes the cruel yet joyful significance of Dionysian dismemberment. And what I will argue is that not only mythological metaphors as more than conceptual languages, such as the explanation of notion ecstasy, but that body's penetrating power as affects can be understood as the translation between metaphysical and physical worlds. So actually body matters, or put in Spinoza's question, and what body can do. That's what all these allegorical impact of Dionysus dismemberment. So I also would like to argue that what the individual suffers most is not Dionysus being torn apart, but its metaphysical meaning as the birth of individual. Yet the suffering of birth of individual can only be mythologically symbolized in Dionysus being torn apart. And finally, I would like to argue that Dionysus' dismemberment, meanwhile, denotes the promise and hope of his rebirth, regarded as the highest joy of the return to primordial unity. and therefore it signifies both the principle of individuation, principium individuationis in Schopenhauer's terms, as well as the shattering of that principle itself, and points to the interwoven state of utmost suffering and joy. So there's a double dismemberment there in this allegory, which I would like to present later. So I will just read from the expert from my paper. Yeah. We have learned from Nietzsche in the Birth of Tragedy that a peculiar kind of suffering was allegorized by the Greek myth through the trope of the dismemberment of Dionysus. Quote, in truth, however, the hero is a suffering Dionysus of the mysteries. The god experiencing in himself the agonies of individuation, of whom wonderful myths tell that as a boy he was torn to pieces by the Titan and how he is worshipped in this state as Zagreus. Thus it is intimated that this dismemberment, the probably Dionysian suffering, is like a transformation into air, water, earth, and fire. That we are therefore to regard the state of individuation as the region and primal cause of all suffering, as something objectionable in itself, unquote. Given that the Greek world was obsessed by mankind's cruelty and wickedness, at first sight there seems to be nothing new about the dismemberment Dionysus suffered. Greek mythology is a catalogue of indescribable cruelty. Yet, if Dionysus' suffering was the sole theme, the only subject matter of Greek tragedy, according to Nietzsche in the Birth of Tragedy, then a deeper probe is required to grasp the mystery of suffering and its meanings presented in Greek tragedy. That said, there seems to be and must be something special about the cruelty that makes Dionysus' sufferings different from the others, that makes Saturn's son suffer from being devoured by his father, or Medea's daughters being slaughtered from their beloved mother, etc. As far as torture and suffering are concerned, the first question we may confront is why dismemberment? Why not some other extremely cruel form of corporeal punishment? The apparent and quick answer is that dismemberment is simply horror that may correspond to the existence of horror that Dionysian world represents. One can only imagine how many horror movies carry the theme of dismemberment as a powerful element to thrill the audiences. In watching a criminal being dismembered, horror is aroused by natural disturbance. Death is realized differently in the experience of witnessing dismemberment, not through the destructive sweep of mighty forces, but the decay, decomposition, and slow and degrading disintegration of individual bodies. Dismemberment shocks us not just because of destruction, but the reduction of life, the putrefaction from the wholeness to disintegration in which traces of individuality are gradually effaced. However, even though we have realized how horrible the corporeal dismemberment is, the first issue we come across here is how seriously we should take this mythical metaphor of the dismemberment of the Dionysus suffering. Is the mythical metaphor merely rhetorical? If we accept Nietzsche's teaching, metaphor is no rhetorical figure, but an image which takes the place of something else, something he can really see before him as a substitute for concept, unquote. We should take mythical metaphor not just as rhetoric, but something more real than reality, unquote. So how do we read this trope? What specifically is Dionysus suffering, despite the terrible physical pain caused by dismemberment? What does it mean to speak of agonies of individuation, and how does it relate to dismemberment as a cruel form of torture? We have seen that Greek mythology has abundance, cruelty, and suffering. So we need not go far so for an answer. Yet, interesting and metaphysical meaning of 凌迟, or death by thousand cuts, the most extreme form of bodily punishment in pre-modern China, may here offer us a clue for speculating on the relationship between the dismemberment and the suffering of individuation. It is commonly assumed that what makes 凌迟 appear as relatively severe, if not the severest, form of torture and punishment is that it undoubtedly causes terrible pain, especially physical pain. However, in speculating about the extremity and severity of torture and punishment, one should be cautious not to take for granted that issues of pain and bodily suffering are the first and foremost concerns. Even Foucault's eloquent utterance about the relationship between torture, pain, indiscipline, and punish cannot avoid the conjecture that leads us to link pain and the extremity of punishment so naturally and firmly. Foucault's idea owes a great deal to Nietzsche's accounts of punishment based on concept of contractual and equivalent relationship between debtor and creditor, symbolizing justice in genealogy of morals, which eventually pursue the body beyond all possible pain. Punishment is calculated in detailed rules. The number of slashes of the whip, the positioning of the branding iron, the type of mutilation to be used. In the light of such an economic calculating notion of punishment, it is easy to understand how extreme a corporeal capital punishment like lynching, death by 1,000 cuts can be. This calculation of repayments through tormented bodies seems universal in all the times, as Nietzsche puts it. The creator could inflict every kind of indignity and torture upon the body of debtor. For example, cut from it as much as seems commensurate with the size of debt. I'll just stop here. Okay. Moreover, as the authors of book Death by 1,000 Cuts, the book about Nietzsche, points out, an execution performed almost anywhere in the world as late as the 18th century was carried out with understanding that someone who had committed the most horrifying crimes should be punished in the most horrible ways. The perpetrator should not simply be killed, he should be made to suffer, physically, psychically, and spiritually, with as such extravagance as was deemed appropriate. The people in earlier ages to execute someone while refraining from imposing pain or degradation was absurd. Following this logic, lynching is prima facie regarded as such a form of execution with the technique of accurate calculation to balance the horrifying misdeeds with extreme form of punishment, turning out to be an art of maintaining life in pain in cost terms. Yet its effects, despite the good sources of fantasy and the benefits of legal or historical studies, seems to be nothing but horror for modern civilized men. Although Nietzsche's and Foucault's endeavors, we have been enlightened as to how hypocritical it may be to eliminate pain and replace the public display of corporeal execution with modern legal institutions. It is, on the other hand, an overestimation of pain in the case of lynching, and hence the punitive form of bodily dismemberment. Suffering was not extraneous to the logic of lynching, but it may not have been the entire purpose of punishment. Filtered through Chinese cultural understanding of death and the worship of ancestors, the penalty came to assume a meaning, the most salient feature of which may not have been pain. To approach this idea as author of Death by 1,000 Cuts do, we can consider lynch in relation to the other harsh penalties that crime law mandated. From general imagination, such a terrifying form of execution seemed to be naturally regarded as the most extreme form of death penalty. Indeed, according to the historical and legal study of the author of Death by 1,000 Cut, the metaphysic meaning of Nietzsche shows that pain may not mean the ultimate fear in dismemberment as a cruelest form of punishment, but the loss of one's somatic integrity that symbolizes one's identity and individuality, as the Death by 1,000 Cuts aptly points out. The crucial issue here is that how the metaphysical meaning of Nietzsche that focuses on the somatic integrity rather than pain can have us understand the ecstatic state. The metaphysical fear of the image of dismemberment gains much more power in Nietzsche's accounts of Greek tragedy. If the metaphysical meaning of Nietzsche signifies fear of loss of individuality, Nietzsche, following in his predecessor, Schopenhauer, nonetheless tries to tell us a different story that does the reverse. Celebrate the loss of oneself through a suffering image of Dionysus. That said, the metaphysical meaning of Nietzsche plays a significant role in the expansion of how Nietzsche turns over the Schopenhauerian model of the suffering of individuality to propose his own idea about the celebration of the loss of oneself. Yet, there's another crucial question we may encounter. Does the tearing apart of the principle of individuation, best allegorized in Dionysus in December as the state of ecstasy, have the equally powerful effects on the tragic audiences? Namely, if the state of ecstasy is heavily loaded on Dionysus, especially due to his being dismemberment as the allegory of the destruction of the principle of individuality, then how does it affect the spectator watching the suffering of tragic heroes as the suffering of Dionysus? To answer this question is at the same time to answer the question that why tragic power is revered to the utmost through the spectacle of Dionysian dismemberment, which meanwhile delineates a particular picture of spectatorial subjectivity. By introducing Dionysus' dismemberment, Nietzsche to some extent has transcended Schopenhauer's metaphysics that purports to lead to the resignation of life and argues for particular subjectivity, the significance of which indicates the highest form of ecstasy. The tearing apart of principium individuationis does not only awake the new artistic phenomena, which is Greek tragedy and music especially, but also give us an important clue of the spectatorial subjectivity. As far as the notion of subjectivity is concerned, we should notice that on the one hand, to delineate a certain type of subjectivity cannot but be metaphysical. As Simon Kreuzer, on Heidegger's account of metaphysics in the history of philosophy, says, quote, metaphysics is always the metaphysics of the subject, insofar as philosophy has always sought to name the subjectum, the ultimate foundation or beginning point for understanding of entities. On the other hand, subjectum, that which lies under, must be able to provide the basis and the foundation, a basis which is not consciousness, soul, or spirit, but body for Nietzsche. The metaphor of Dionysian dismemberment comes into being under these tensional, if not irreconcilable conditions. So the why and how Nietzsche accepted Schopenhauer's metaphysics and later developed for himself the project of overcoming the metaphysics is a much larger topic than this paper can cover. It is nonetheless arguable that in the agreement of the suffering of individuation proposed by Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's anxiety of the over-determination of metaphysics might be an incentive of the invention of Dionysus is tragic dismemberment, as well as the hope of its rebirth. It is widely acknowledged that Nietzsche challenges the traditional view in the West that bodies are separate from and morally inferior to minds, and it is willing to replace soul with body as a fundamental life trait. As he argued that it is essential, quote, to start from the body and employ it as life, it is a much richer phenomenon, unquote. And what belief in the body is more fundamental than belief in the soul. The latter arose from unscientific reflection on the body, unquote. We may argue that this is why, for Nietzsche accept from Schopenhauer the metaphysical significance of the principle of individuation as the main source of our sufferings. He nonetheless has to challenge the mind or soul-oriented model and add some body-oriented one. The metaphysical sense of the principle of individuation as the source of suffering is thus embodied in a mystical metaphor of Dionysian dismemberment, which echoes the extremity of bodily torture. As we have realized that what Dionysus suffered most is not corporeal demise and death, but the coming into being of individual, generated by, quote, the state of individuation as the source and primal cause of all suffering, as something inherently to be rejected, unquote. We can outline a particular object implicit in the model of Dionysian dismemberment. What individual suffers most is indeed not, sorry. Is indeed not Dionysians being torn apart, but its metaphysical meaning as a birth of individual. Yet the suffering of the birth of individual can only be symbolized or allegorized in the mystical allegory of Dionysus being torn apart. Individual is the after effect of Dionysian dismemberment as a process of individuation, while the shattering of the principle of individuation means the end of it and points to the hope of the rebirth of Dionysus, the returning to the primal unity. Shattering and dismemberment plays a key role here as the breaking up of primary unity first, and then as the tearing apart of the principle that causes the previous breaking up. Dismemberment, therefore, has a double sense in the model of Dionysian dismemberment, signifying both the birth and end of individuation. Nietzsche actually sets for this idea even for the birth of a tragedy. The epoch hoped for a rebirth of Dionysus, which we much now understand as an end to individuation. It was this feature, Sir Dionysus, whom the epoch's thunder-rung song of jubilation celebrated. That's a mistake. And only in this hope is there a ray of joy on the face of the war, torn and split into individuals, as is symbolized in the myth of Demeter, who sank into eternal mourning by the dismemberment of Dionysus, is glad again for the first time and being told that she can once more give birth to Dionysus. Through this double sense, dismemberment and the dismemberment of dismemberment, the possibility of the joint of pain and joy comes into being. The particular logic found in the model of Dionysian dismemberment is due to the metaphysical preposition of the inexorability of the essence of the world, which Nietzsche apparently still follows at the time of writing The Birth of Tragedy. Dionysus is the ontological essence of the world, which is inaccessible, and because of this inaccessibility, we are left instead with mystical metaphor. Given the fact that Dionysian dismemberment is a metaphor, a metaphor about the suffering of individuation, we could only adopt the metaphor of dismemberment as such, to think of ecstasy as the capacity of transposing oneself to the other, not as a result of a Dionysus being torn into pieces and becoming individual. For the pre-state of Dionysus is the prime moral unity, and his being dismembered signifies the birth to individual that causes us to suffer. By the same token, it is dismemberment itself that can allow us to think about the shattering of the principle of individuation that brings about joy. Dismemberment presupposes the possibility of ecstasy. One experiences one's self-loss as Dionysus being torn apart, signifying the end of individuation, to reach the state of ecstasy in which pain and joy mingles. Due to the metaphysical implication, Dionysian dismemberment points out something higher than the shattering of individuality, shattering as individuation, the primal cause of suffering, as the possibility of ecstasy. Yet the effectiveness of the metaphor itself is its constituent action, shattering, tearing apart, dissolution as the presupposition of the ecstatic state. The effectiveness of Dionysian dismember as mystical metaphor can only be brought out through body, which is so fundamental for Nietzsche. Nietzsche elaborates body and describes consciousness as, quote, the last and latest development of the organic, and hence also what is most unfinished and unstrung, unquote. In the phrase with the first line stating psychology of metaphysics, the influence of Timothy, Nietzsche says, quote, that which has been feared the most, the cause of the most powerful suffering, lust to rule, sex, etc., has been treated by men with the greatest amount of hostility and eliminated from the true world. Thus, they have eliminated the effects only by one. Positive God as antithesis of evil, that is, taste reality in the negation of desire and affect, i.e., in nothingness. In the same way, they have hated the irrational, the arbitrary, the accidental, as the causes of immeasurable physical suffering. As a consequence, they negated this element in being itself and conceived it as absolute rationality and purposiveness. There are always desire and even compulsion for philosophers to rationally simplify the world to dissipate the fear of sufferings from the more fundamental desire and effort. Yet this compulsion does not enable us to fix the real world, but to arrange a world for ourselves in which our existence is made possible. Unquote. Philosophers thereby tend to create a world which is capable, simplified, and comprehensible for us, and consequently the emphasis of consciousness, substance, soul, spirit, concept concretely related to metaphysics has become inevitable. Yet Nietzsche exhorts us to turn away from this erroneous tendency by emphasizing the primary body driving state. I will skip the quote here because we're running out of time. As Venison points out, there's a desire for Nietzsche to return to nature, and hence animality, and is based on the same concern. The terrible basic text of Homo Natura must again be recognized. And Nietzsche urges us to look at what is fundamental lying under humanity, on the errors of this process of simplification as a project metaphysics, is that concepts propagated through metaphysical spirit, be they scientific, religious, or moral, fail to recognize that everything that enters consciousness as an apparent unity actually comes from an inner world of body instincts, loaded with forces, not in organized and purposive system, but in chaos and confusion. The inner world of body instincts is actually a streaming plurality for nature, while the spirit nonetheless strives to simplify them, quote, the commanding element, whatever it is, that is generally called spirit, wants to dominate itself and its surroundings, and to fear its domination. The weird simplicity alters multiplicity. It is abiding, subduing, domineering, and truly immasterable will, unquote. Nietzsche aims exactly to reverse this will as he precisely precursor, quote, error reaches its peak when Schopenhauer taught us. The only way to be true to knowledge lies precisely in getting free from ethics, from will, unquote, and illustrate the vivid picture of Dionysian world with multiple forces. In addition to intoxication, orgy, dancing, etc., all associated with the multiple and chaotic power of bodily forces, Dionysian dismemberment comes in as a reminder again what body can do with the utmost sovereign enjoyment, as Nietzsche's ambition to win back from the man of knowledge the right to great effects. What does Dionysian dismemberment, if it is effective in showing us how ecstasy is possible through the metaphorical image of body being torn apart? Not simplify the concept of ecstasy as the metaphysical thought of the shattering of the principle of individual birth. If Nietzsche's original intention is to show the plural drives and forces body as fundamental phenomenon and as the capacity for transposition, then what is the simple metaphysical idealization of this plurality for? Despite the seeming inevitability of simplifying the world as philosophizing for Nietzsche, the body strives to simplify the chaos of the world in order to pluralize, while the conceptual idea simplifies the body effect in order to unify them. Perhaps showing the plurality of unity is Nietzsche's intention, reflecting his belief in which philosophy can really reach. Or skip the quote. Therefore, the process of the reversal of complexity to simplicity, i.e., the spirit to the body, is not tantamount to a pure return to nature or animality. As Tristan Brown argues, quote, the body to which we would return is not any we recognize from a perceivable past. It is not identifiable mass or mechanism or physiology, but appears as a complex brain that interprets psyche and body and defines the idea of our intuitive feeling. While body opens up the vision of the plurality that simplifies chaos of the world, the metaphysical idea that body mirrors keeps the unity possible. Avoiding simplification or systemization and enhancing the characteristics of the plurality of unity. In this sense, subjectivity as metaphysical concept, the echo body drives in terms of plurality, and the interpretation between psychic and body as presuming what spirit can do or body does, and vice versa. Now I draw my conclusion here. It may not be too remarkable to see that the concept of tragic joy is and has to be embodied in the mystical metaphor of Dionysian dismemberment. If, as Eric Brundels in his book Nietzsche, the body and culture argues that metaphor articulates not only the style of Nietzsche's descriptive language, but also the interpretive status of his object itself, the body, then not only mythological metaphor says more than conceptual language, but that body's penetrating power as affect can be understood as translation between metaphysical and physical world. Moreover, the notion of dismemberment that recognizes the communion of death, which the process of disintegration, along with the successive transfer to formless human body, where discrete individual identity is insignificant, indicate that somatic and psychic boundaries of self have become indistinct. not only the frail boundaries of the metaphysical domain, referring to the allegorical function of Dionysian dismemberment, but more importantly, all the uncontained sovereignty of subject, finite yet with a limit. This is why Dionysian ecstasy, which deeply, if not inevitably, embodied in this dismemberment, carries weight, for it is the state of excess, eliminating the self and exceeding the limit, as if what happens in transgression is always accompanied with disruption. There's no transgression without disrupting of limit. Transgression cannot be disrupted. The limit, and yet meanwhile we create a new limit to be transgressed. Therefore, the boundary is withdrawn as reinstated, producing an unending round of transgression, disruption, and reinstatement, as John Sellis pointed out. And it is at this boundary that the dual nature of Dionysius is revealed, correspondent to the duality of reunion and dismemberment, joy and pain, or suffering, dread, horror, etc. Yet the Dionysian is not simply a breaking of boundaries or just an absence itself, as a feeling that. Whereas Nietzsche shows us how subjectivity is dissolved in Dionysian intoxication and frenzy, as self-forgetting restores our attention to a joining and unified primal state that is beyond the ordinary human subjective experience, which is reflected in the mythological allegory of Dionysian dismemberment. Okay, so I finish reading my paper, and
Thank you very much for your lecture. Very interesting discussion, Dionysus here and Nietzsche. Maybe you can unshare the screen so we can kind of see each other better. Is that possible?
I think about how to.
Yeah, take your time.
About this.
Yes, go to. Yeah, I can also do it for you.
Yeah, please.
Okay, there we go.
Oh,
All right. That's the powers of the host. Okay, so.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that power.
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks so much. So we have it's 9:38, so we have some minutes for questions and discussion. So you can either raise your hand or just send me any message in the chat. So maybe I'll start it off then. Thanks for the talk. I thought the account of this metaphor of Dionysus in the Birth of Tragedy was rather clear and helpful and interesting. I wanted to ask you maybe a question that you did not directly address in the paper, and it's not the subject of your paper, but I am just curious, for my own interest in Nietzsche, is how the idea of Dionysus and the story of Dionysus and this myth of Dionysus, how Nietzsche's interpretation of this myth changes over time. And I'm just also just thinking generally about how, Dionysus reappears again, for example, in Twilight of the Idols. But, by that time in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche really has a different understanding. It's not only art, but reality, so he's moved away from the kind of reliance on Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's philosophy. So, but he preserves and kind of rethinks the figure of Dionysus later on. So I'm curious how you, if you have any thoughts to share about how Nietzsche rethinks the figure of Dionysus as his thinking develops over time. I know it's not what you were addressing in your paper, but I am curious if you have any thoughts on that subject.
Okay. Yeah, first, I would say that I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, maybe like Professor or anyone. But so I'm not quite clear how we later developed and how we switched any idea on Nietzsche, but I think later on he seemed to forget Nietzsche. If I'm wrong, please help me again, because it seems to be the evil mensch. Yeah. So what I'm more say you're not your question are not directed to my paper, so my answer is not. I would like to go back to my presentation, because what I'm trying to argue is probably how this Dionysus as a mystical figure, how he functions, or how he plays such an important role. What the simple question is why Nietzsche lost Dionysus? Yeah. And what I'm trying to say is that because it points out what mythology is all about. Yeah, it's not just created, imagined a mystical figure, but it can go deeply into Nietzsche's articulation about the concepts such as ecstasy. Yeah. So going back to your question, maybe later on he finds that that this. I mean, when he wrote the Birth of Charity, I think there is a Dionysus living in his body, yeah, something like that. And so even you can grow up this discussion of so many discussions on Dionysus, so that that's why this mystical impact is seen. It's quite different from say Nietzsche talks about what mythology is about, or there are many papers on Schelling or any philosopher, but simply he transforms himself to Dionysus. That's what I'm saying. And maybe later on, it's not that necessary, or there's no necessity as he simply adopted this mystical figure as his own. And that's why I'm sorry I didn't.
Oh, thank you. It's okay. Thanks. So any further questions or other questions? Jesper?
Oh, yes. Thank you for your talk. I have a question out of interest. I'm also interested in the notion of ecstasis, or mostly coming from Schelling, but also a bit coming from other philosophers. And I think it's interesting here with Nietzsche, because we have just heard in Wang's talk that Nietzsche was interesting because he turned around the primacy of thinking or thought, so as to put emotion or the bodily or whatever in the foreground. And I think this is right. It has something to it, and I would like to hear your thoughts about how this hangs together, how this is related to the concept of ecstasis, because ecstasis is, of course, as you also mentioned, has something to do with being brought out of place, or been taken out of place. And you know that in ancient Greece they called the people who'd gone insane. They were also going into ecstasis. These were people being insane. But in the philosophical tradition, ecstasis has something to do often with the direct intuition of God, intellectual intuition. And I think it's very interesting what you here noticed also in relation to the last talk, that ecstasis here in Nietzsche has something to do with feelings, with the bodily, and so on. So maybe you could elaborate this a bit. I find it very, very interesting. It's like an ecstasy going in the opposite direction as the alternative philosophical or the preceding philosophical tradition. So how ecstasies and the turn towards the bodily could hang together in Nietzsche.
Okay. So Nietzsche actually did not, if I'm right, Nietzsche actually did not directly elaborate what ecstasy is all about. Yeah, but can I hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but I always think there is a disrupt, or maybe a jump, a break between the Nietzsche. If there is a break between Nietzsche and the traditional philosophy, and I'll say that its ecstasy should come in, plays an important role in Nietzsche's philosophy. But Nietzsche himself never talked about what is ecstasy all about, but he simply act in writing as what ecstasy is all about. Yeah. So that's why my idea is that's why we bring in all these Dionysius, especially Dionysus being dismembered, because this, as I present my paper, the state of dismemberment metaphysically really points out to the state of ecstasy. Yeah. So, but I'm not quite sure what your question is about. So it's about how Nietzsche think about ecstasy, or how ecstasy plays a role as this disrupt between this traditional philosophy and Nietzschean philosophy.
Yeah, you're right. It was just a question out of interest that Nietzsche seems to go in the opposite direction of the tradition, where the tradition often said ecstasy has something with intuition to do, Anschauung. And Nietzsche, when he then refers to Dionysus as this becoming mute or something, speechless. You stop the speech so you can go back to feeling or the chaos while the creative. And so this was just a thought, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to say there is, as I point out in my paper, I say that there's a translation there between the metaphysical and the physical world. And I think the later on, the physical world is highlighted by Nietzsche in terms of ecstasy, but only through articulating this in a Dionysian voice that this ecstasy can be brought in, can reveal itself. Yeah, that's my idea. But rather than talking about what ecstasy is about, something like a Heideggerian interpretation of Nietzsche. Yeah. So I mean, there's no interpretation there. Just and what's more important for Nietzsche is about body, about affect, emotion, rather than this all these conceptual thoughts. That's right. Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mengshi Chen. Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you for everybody for questions in the discussion. I think we'll take about a 10-minute break, and we'll come back for the very last talk of the evening or the afternoon, and that will be on Hans Blumenberg. So it'll be our only talk on this subject. So look forward to seeing you in 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. Good to see you, Nate.
Hey, Greg, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. How was Athens?
Athens is pretty good, I think. I've been inside my house too much, so not really sure about the rest of it.
I understand. I understand.
How have you been?
Yeah, pretty well. I've mostly been in my house as well, mostly due to coronavirus regulations in Hong Kong, which have only recently relaxed. We're a bit behind the rest of the world, but I do plan on visiting the States this summer. So,
Oh, great.
for the first
The
time
good
in
news.
2 years.
The good news for you being behind is that I think we're about to have another surge of COVID cases here in the States.
I see. Okay. Well, it's bad news for you. Okay.
Yeah, well,
All right.
so it goes, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So this is our last talk of the day, and we'll pick up again tomorrow. So let me first introduce the speaker. So our next speaker is Nathan Batcher, and Nathan Batcher has a PhD from the University of Georgia, which is also my alma mater. So we're both graduates from UGA. He completed his PhD on Hans Blumenberg under Elizabeth Bryant, who is also one of my teachers. I should also note that Elizabeth Bryant will be one of the keynote speakers in a conference I've organized for December. I guess I'll go ahead and advertise this now, on contradiction truth in Christian Neoplatonism, contradiction in truth in Christian Neoplatonism in December. So that should be fun. Nate, his dissertation title was, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Significance and the Indefinite in Hans Blumenberg's Work on Myth. Yeah?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we're old office mates, and I'm excited to hear him speak today. The title of the talk is Myth and Function of Patterns in History in Blumenberg's Work on Myth. So take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to say just a couple of words before I start reading, because that title is no longer exactly appropriate. That paper I noticed that Blumenberg was dealing with philosophy of history and Romanticism also in a similar way to how he was dealing with myth, by focusing on the sort of patterns that they sketched out in their thinking. And so I thought I would be able to focus on what he says about those patterns and see what he had against philosophy of history, basically. But then, basically, I thought there would be a claim such as the philosophy of history is basically mythical, and that's what's wrong with it. But I realized at the end of the paper that he was treating philosophy of history like myth, but that wasn't the problem with philosophy of history. So in returning to this idea, I have instead looked at a use of myth in a theoretical work where it wasn't a problem, which work is his own work on myth, which begins with a myth. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. One part of Blumenberg's strategy in work on myth is to argue that myth is not a preparatory stage for reason by showing that myth is itself rational, a product of reason. He makes this argument by distinguishing the function of myth from the function of theoretical reason, and then showing that myth's function is a rational function. The function of myth is to produce, quote, distance from the quality of uncanniness, end quote, or to reduce the feeling that the world is or contains an overwhelming and hostile power, in order that the world can seem to be more stable, a more suitable place for human habitation. One of the ways myth accomplishes this is by making the causes of uncanniness available to us by telling stories about how we can get along with those causes or pacify them. It even tells stories about how these causes are limited by other such causes. Just as important for this study is Blumenberg's claim that myth fulfills its function by deflecting questions, by refusing to provide explanations, or by letting, quote, by letting inquiry run up against the rampart of its images and stories. Theoretical inquiry, on the other hand, in its pursuit of knowledge, must always be prepared to have the answers it provides be subjected to further questions, and it must strive for total indifference to the objects of its inquiry. Myth is rational, Blumenberg claims, because what it accomplishes is necessary, and because myth accomplishes this need better than other things we might use. In particular, theoretical rationality is unable to fulfill this need, and even more, theoretical reason causes this need to increase by virtue of its success. Myth, then, is rational not because it produces knowledge, but because it is a tool for dealing with significance. I will present Blumenberg's account of why it is necessary to deal with significance below. In fact, it is part of the work accomplished by Blumenberg's initial situation, the story he tells at the beginning of work on myth, and to which I devote most of this study. For the present, however, let me point to some features of the concept of significance as it appears in work on myth. Significance is described in contradistinction to meaning. Whereas the meaning of a thing is definite, significance appears as the suggestion of as the suggestion that something means, that it matters, that it is relevant to the individual, but without going so far as to mean something specific. He says, it already means without any what. The relevances provide structuring differentiations. They allow things in the world to stand out as potentially meaningful to humans, and by so doing, work against the leveling off of everything in the environment that can result from the excessive taxing of the nervous system in the face of what Blumenberg calls the absolutism of reality, but also from the leveling off that is from the success of the theoretical attitude. Blumenberg claims that the ability to recognize these significances and to deal with significance, to, quote, work on it, end quote, is necessary for self and world understanding and is for the purpose of orientation within the world. Myth is the tool best suited to this purpose. If a tool that is best suited to accomplishing something necessary can be thought of as something rational, then myth can be thought of as something rational. That's the basis of his argument. Blumenberg goes a step further, however, and suggests that though he does not make he doesn't make this claim explicitly, but he suggests that myth has a place not only in the world, but it has a place in the theoretical venture itself, even though it doesn't produce knowledge. There are two quotations that suggest something of this sort, which I have tried to take as a guide for this study, and I'm going to read two slightly longer quotations. The first one reads the following way. If one asks oneself the question, what is the source of the iconic constancy of unit myths, then there is one answer, an answer that sounds trivial and all too simple to satisfy our expectations. The fundamental patterns of myth are simply so sharply defined, so valid, so binding, so gripping in every sense that they convince us again and again and still present themselves as the most useful material for any search for how matters stand on a basic level with human existence, end quote. Here, he stops short of claiming that it produces knowledge. The question of how matters stand on a basic level with human existence is one, I am quite confident, which we cannot answer with any certainty. What is the benefit, if this is the case, of appealing to myth in our attempts to think about such a question? I'll try to answer that at the end of the paper. The second passage I want to consider here suggests a kind of answer to this question. Blumenberg tells the story in which Goethe writes to his friend Zelter after learning that Zelter's only son has died. In this letter, Goethe reveals to Zelter that he, quote, believes in the immortality of the monad that is hardened by life's activity. The world spirit directs it, he says, to new activities, for which it had to qualify itself here. Thus, it cannot lack employment for eternity. As if to justify this glimpse into the personal, comforting myth, in effect retracting it immediately after offering it, Goethe continues. And here's the quote from Goethe. "Forgive me these abstruse expressions, but people have always lost themselves in such regions and tried to communicate through such manners of speaking where reason could not reach, but they nevertheless did not want unreason to rule." Blumenberg continues here, "No one has ever articulated more precisely why reason admits needs which it arouses itself without being able in its regular discipline to satisfy them. Not in order to acquire secretly, after all, the excess that is denied to it, but in order not to let unreason to gain power over the unoccupied space." Right, so it has a kind of orienting function. And in addition, myth allows us to gain some sort of ground between knowledge and unreason, according to this quotation. I want to be very explicit here that Blumenberg does not claim that myth necessarily does this. And I think it is important to say the usefulness of myth in the search for how matters stand and its ability to protect against unreason are connected in Blumenberg's theory to the form a myth takes on as a result of its process of formation, which I will describe below. And so this usefulness is connected to myths we have inherited from antiquity in Blumenberg's theory. Despite the degree to which his theory of myth attends to myth's function, the function of myth is intimately tied to the form of the specific inherited myths. He seems to view this form as a kind of protection against the abuses that were associated, for example, with the use of political myths in the 20th century. The clearest indication that Blumenberg accords to myth or to the reception of myth conceived as work on myth some epistemological function, or at least some role in the theoretical venture, is to be found in the placement and function of the story of the initial situation of humanity in this work. Blumenberg takes as given that the origins of the contents of myth are inaccessible, and so what remains is to try to understand myth by discerning its function. This function is to service the need for significance. The need for significance has its roots, in Blumenberg's account, in a radical change in the way of life and one of the stages in the development of the human species. I will return to the story in more detail in just a minute, but I want to observe here at the beginning that although Blumenberg claims for this story a basis in scientific research, he says it represents the common core of all currently respected theories of anthropogenesis, he also introduces it with the claim that it serves the purpose of the old status naturalis of philosophical theories of culture and state. And he draws our attention to its resemblance to a mythical pattern, a pattern to which he will devote an entire work later in his career, The Exit from the Cave. So I don't want to equate, on the one hand, the purpose of the idea of status naturalis in Hobbes or Rousseau with the function of myth, nor to make the general claim that every story that has some element of myth is simply a myth. It is important to proceed more carefully than that here. Rousseau, who Blumenberg cites later in this work, claims that his status naturalis is a story that was intended to illuminate, quote, to illuminate the reality of human nature, the nature of things, end quote, as he understood it, but was not to be thought of as historical fact. He says explicitly that there never was a man in a state of nature. Blumenberg introduces his story and the related concept of the absolutism of reality, which he encounters Blumenberg introduces his story and the related concept of the absolutism of reality because he, quote, encounters the necessity of picturing an initial situation, of picturing conditions that would explain or could explain what followed, because we have no access to those conditions themselves. So we can conclude that Blumenberg intends us not to take this story as factual. The second factor that links this story to myth will prove, I think, to be more productive. The story he tells has the pattern of an emergence from a cave, that is to say, a mythical pattern. In what follows, I will argue that Blumenberg's work suggests a relation between the form of myth and the function of myth, and that this relation allows myth also to have an epistemological function despite its differences from theoretical rationality, and despite Blumenberg's insistence that myth refuses to answer questions. This argument is primarily textual and interpretive, and here it is. In order to make the case that myth has a kind of epistemological function, I will provide a sketch of those elements of Blumenberg's account of myth that are necessary for it. This claim itself will appear at several points to contradict passages with which I support it, so I beg your patience. I want to be clear, however, that I do not intend by this claim that myth does, after all, provide knowledge about those things of which it speaks. Rather, myth provides for certain conditions without which the pursuit of the kind of knowledge that is available to us would be impossible. Blumenberg's account of myth is functional in that he begins his account of myth by describing its anthropological function. To say that myth has an anthropological function here is to say that it provides something that is necessary if human life is to be possible. Myth itself appears not to be necessary. It is, like all human products, contingent. It corresponds, however, to some need. It retains, even in its later forms, something of the ad hoc character of its development. In order to describe the need to which myth corresponds, that is, to present its function, Blumenberg tells a story about a major step in the process of the development of the human species. In this story, the quadrupedal and tree-dwelling human creature, pre-human creature, at the same time abandons the forest and its former posture, and takes on, in exchange, life on the open savanna and an upright posture. In so doing, this creature gives up, quote, an adapted way of life, end quote. That is, in addition to its shelter and its means of escape, it gives up the usefulness of its biological adaptations to life in its specific environment. Blumenberg conceives this change explicitly as a choice made against the pressures of selection, as a means of avoiding biological specialization that result from such adaptation. This creature now finds itself without a place to hide because it stands on two legs, it is visible from a greater distance, and unable to flee quickly. Because it has changed environment, the context in which the responses triggered by specific stimuli tended to succeed has been abandoned. And as a result, those stimuli no longer have strict meanings. On the open plain, without the shelter of the forest and given its upright posture, the creature can be seen from a much greater distance. Corresponding to this visibility, however, its field of vision is also greatly increased. The placement of its eyes on the front of its head, finally, means that the majority of this field is behind it, unseen. The horizon, which circumscribes this largely unseen field of vision, comes to represent the sum of directions from which the unknown can attack. Because it cannot flee successfully, this creature must reach out towards this horizon in expectation, must eventually develop ways for dealing with these eventual attacks that don't depend upon physical strength or speed. Blumenberg calls the response to this change the absolutism of reality. He explains, quote, what it means is that man came close to not having control of the conditions of his existence and, what is more important, believed that he simply lacked control of them. This situation makes necessary rapid and far-reaching cognitive developments, culminating in the use of concepts, developments that make possible the human way of life. Before these accomplishments, however, the elevation of the nervous system and the stretching out to the horizon of its expectations produces a state of anxiety, which Blumenberg distinguishes from fear in that the object of anxiety is indefinite, whereas the object of fear is something indefinite. Sorry, object of anxiety is indefinite, the object of fear is definite. Anxiety is not sustainable for the long term and must be reduced to something with which the creature can deal, that is, to fear. It is precisely here that Blumenberg identifies myth's function. Myth reduces anxiety to fear by transforming the unknown terrors, the amorphous powerfulness of the world, into named powers, and telling stories of the way humans might deal with those powers, or of the way that the existence and actions of a number of powers limits the ability of other powers to execute their will. Myth, then, allows us to deal with the anxiety of living in a world in which the conditions of human life appear to be out of human control. It does so by transforming the indefinite, hostile powerfulness that appears in human experience to something definite. Before we proceed with this account, I want to note that the conditions that make this way of life possible, which we might even say make it necessary for the survival of the human creature, can be described as a kind of poverty of adaptation or adaptive mechanisms. Blumenberg at times describes this poverty from the perspective of epistemology, which is particularly relevant for this paper. Because things in the environment have lost their immediate reference, they entered into the experience of this pre-human creature with a relevance that was unclear. That is to say, with the suggestion of meaningfulness, but not with definite meaning. This indefinite suggestion of meaningfulness is what Blumenberg calls significance. Okay. The next part. Blumenberg claims that we gain access to significance by telling stories, and we must, I think, begin from the notion that the myths we have inherited are primarily stories. Blumenberg does not, however, spend much time considering narrative, nor does he treat myth as a species of narrative. In fact, because he is interested in the reception of myth, which may take up an image or a pattern from a myth, just enough to be recognizable, he concerns himself more with the operation of myth in these smaller units. There are indications in work on myth that will point to different ways to think about such units, but for the purpose of this paper, I will focus on what I've called narrative patterns, narrative devices, and which Blumenberg introduces as, quote, the means of operation with which significance works and with which work on significance is done, end quote. Blumenberg lists the most prominent of these means of operation, and here's that list: simultaneity, latent identity, the closed circle pattern, the recurrence of the same, the reciprocity between resistance and heightened existence, and the isolation of a thing or action in the degree of reality ascribed to it to the point of excluding every competing reality, end quote. I refer to these as narrative patterns, but I would like to articulate more fully what I have in mind. First, these means of operation stand out as something recognizable. They suggest meaningfulness. They resist interpretation as accident. Such figures or patterns stand out further because they are improbable. Here's a quotation: history, like life, works against the tendency of a situation to be increasingly determined by probability. End quote. The means of operation listed above are simple, elementary figures or patterns, according to or upon which names and events can be arrayed for the sake of displaying their significance. So while the Odyssey, for example, is perhaps the most iconic example of the closed circle pattern, in which meaning and stability are restored by Odysseus's return home, the celestial and meteorological events at the death of Caesar suggest that even the cosmos recognizes that something significant has happened, and that's an example of simultaneity that he gives. Second, I want to consider a metaphor Blumenberg introduces to describe the way myth deals with the problem he calls integration. Since myth consists of stories that are to a large extent dislocated in space and time, as a result, it is only by means of names and their genealogical relation that myth attains some definiteness. In this account, Blumenberg refers to these names as, quote, the matter that belongs quite exclusively to myth, implying a metaphor of form and matter. This metaphor yields slightly different conclusions than, for example, thinking of myth as form and content, which Blumenberg also does in this chapter on Darwinism. Though here too, Blumenberg claims that the content of myth is the result of its form. Okay, if names correspond to matter in this analogy or metaphor, everything else that makes a story is on the side of form. We see this metaphorical conception of myth at work in Blumenberg's reading of the Oedipus myth, and specifically in his reading of Aeschylus's version. He sees this myth as a version of the closed circle pattern as an establishment of meaning and stability in the world, and notes that what is most important for the function of the myth about the crimes Oedipus commits is, quote, not the type of guilt that Oedipus unknowingly lays on himself through patricide and incest, but rather in the way in which he discovers it. The atrocities that are attached to Oedipus, he continues, more than being concealed in him, are exceptional in the way in which they are adapted to the formal schema of the tragedy. Blumenberg stops short of claiming that the form is the origin of the matter here. It is a central part of his theory that such origins are not available to theory. He does, however, claim that what is important for our understanding of myth is its function, and that we can discover this function in the form rather than in the material of myth. Further, as we see here, this form determines the particular shape of the narrative. Okay. The next step in this argument has to do with Blumenberg's account of the Darwinistic formation of myth. In this account, the formation of myth in the milieu of oral performance and transmission provides an answer to the question of what made its later survival possible. Myths underwent a strenuous process of testing before an audience, a process of optimization such that those elements that worked, that were called for again and again by the audience, were retained, and those that did not were discarded. Blumenberg describes the condition the myths eventually acquired, or more precisely, the quality this condition gives to the myth as pregnance. Blumenberg associates this term with Goethe's notion of imprinted form, geprägte Form. This account has as its basis a metaphor of stamping, according to which the form of a thing is imprinted in some matter. The repeated retellings of a myth and the refinement of the story to suit the needs and desires of the audience defines ever more sharply the form of the story, its narrative pattern, and imprints that pattern ever more deeply in the matter. The historical changes to which myth and its receptions are a response exert pressure on a myth and on the one retelling it, and this pressure distorts the narrative pattern. What makes myth so durable is that the imprinted pattern is sufficiently sharp and clear so that it remains recognizable despite these distortions. This quality itself of having passed through so much time is communicated through the pattern and through the telling of the stories, and contributes to the feeling of reliability they give. The fact that myth retains its identity despite such distortion goes some way toward explaining its appeal. Only those stories the audience asked for repeatedly survive, but this is a story not only of survival, but more importantly of optimization by means of the fine textured and intensive testing of the reliable effectiveness of those stories and their elements. This testing allows the elements of the stories that are not effective to be altered. It allows the stories themselves to take on the pregnance, the imprinted form that gives to myth its unique quality. It is important, too, to this account that the effect and effectiveness of these stories be reliable, that the stories themselves demonstrate in some way the stability whose absence in the archaic experience of the world gives rise to the need for myth in the first place. The most distinctive part of this account is the intersection of human evolution and the evolution of myth. Myth functions in this connection as a means by which humans institute, quote, the avoidance of the pressures of selection, and end quote, and by means of this avoidance become human. There are two aspects of Blumenberg's theory to observe here. First, there is the account of human development. Humans achieved the protection they needed from the pressures of selection by interposing their culture, that is myth, between themselves and those pressures. Second, there is the process of the formation of those elements of culture as a result of their interaction with these forces. This analogy, however, is based on the pressures that an environment or the attempt to survive an environment exert upon an organism living in that environment. These pressures are natural. They have to do with an organism's need for food and water and shelter and to escape predation, and with the ways in which these needs become suddenly more urgent and more difficult to fulfill as a result of the change of biotope described in the initial situation. As the next step in my argument, I want to introduce the concept pair work of myth and work on myth. Blumenberg uses the phrase work of myth to designate myth's anthropological function, the production of distance between the individual and the terrors of the world, the conversion of anxiety in the face of the absolutism of reality into this distance, the humanization of the world by means of the reduction of anxiety, the production of stability or security. Work on myth, at its most basic, is the reception of myth. The story with which Blumenberg introduces the concept of the absolutism of reality cannot be taken as an account of its origin, however, since we have no access to such origins, and is intended, rather, to make the function of myth intelligible. Myth allows for the gaining of distance from the terrors of the world, but some distance from the absolutism of reality must be gained before it is possible to begin telling myths. This is to say that no matter how far back we try to look, we will find evidence of the work of myth already at work. Second, Blumenberg claims that the function of work on myth, even in later forms, embedded in literature, astronomy, psychology, or other theoretical ventures, tends in the same direction, the production of distance, as does archaic myth. Furthermore, in Blumenberg's account of the formation of myth, a given myth takes on its form by means of the repeated retellings of that myth. So the reception of myth is the mode of the formation of myth. Work on myth, then, is not only the reception of already formed myths, but the way that myth comes to have that form. It would, I think, be an exaggeration to say that the form and the function of myth collapse into one another, but the two seem to have a mutually informing relationship. This escapes a chicken and egg dilemma, if it does, only because this is not an attempt to identify an origin, but to describe a function. We have considered a number of different formulas for the function of myth to produce distance from terror or to convert that terror into distance. A mode or action for the humanization of the world, telling of stories to give access to and work on significance. We might call myth a human cultural formation that performs this function. Myth performs this function by means of the narrative patterns, which are forming elements of myth. Myth comes to be what it is, that is, comes to be able to perform its function by means of these patterns. Because of the function, the need, the forms develop. In order to display this function further, Blumenberg tells a story that has the form of a myth. Because of the way that myths develop in this theory, the forms themselves contain, as it were, the functioning of the myth. If that is the case, however, the story on which this theory is based has the function of a myth, which is to say, not to present knowledge, but to work on significance. It is hard to understand why, in this theory, one would need to transform savage terror into distance, but we might at least ask what purpose the inclusion of a myth at such an important location serves in this work. It could serve a more or less direct epistemological purpose, but since, like a myth, it prevents inquiry into its own factual basis, it would fail as such a basis for knowledge. It could, alternatively, as in the passage I read at the beginning of this paper, open up that space between knowledge and unreason. But how are we to understand this ground, and what is its purpose, this space between knowledge and unreason? One of the things that myth makes possible in Blumenberg's story of the initial condition, by making significance available, is the ability to distinguish what in the landscape is relevant to the individual. And this is a precondition for orientation within that landscape. It may be the case that we can take this as a guide in characterizing this middle ground. Perhaps the story of the initial situation provides an account of the significance of this theory of myth if the activity of work on myth and that let me read that sentence again. Perhaps this story of the initial situation provides an account of the significance of this theory of myth, of the activity of work on myth, and that such significance is desirable even in a theoretical venture because it provides an opportunity to orient ourselves within that venture. Not only then would it be the case that the success of theoretical rationality calls for work on significance within the whole human life, but then it would also call for this work within theory itself. In concept, however, what is orientation in thinking? One is able to orient oneself in one's attempt to think about things that are not possible objects of experience by virtue of one's orienting oneself with reference to thinking about possible objects of experience, that is, within reason's proper domain. If my suggestion here is correct, this would constitute a kind of reversal of Kant's thinking, using something that cannot be an object of knowledge for the sake of orientation within a theoretical venture. But if that's the case, does this not require us to question the stability of such an orienting structure? Okay. And that's the end.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Nate, for the presentation. Very informative and clear articulation of Blumenberg's account of myth. Thank you for presenting on Blumenberg. I think you may be the only person who's discussing that in the 3 days. So it's a valuable contribution. So we have, yeah, of course, we have about 10 minutes for discussion. So floor is open for questions. And you can either just send me your name, put your hand up, or okay. Martijn, it's better, yeah. Okay, you're up.
I listened to Hey You as well. All things
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
So thank you for this wonderful and detailed paper that has really helped me brush up on my Blumenberg. Truly essential thinker. We should all pay more attention to. I was hoping I could draw you out a little bit more, perhaps a little away from Blumenberg and through to questions that in one way or the other we all seem to be asking at this conference without having necessarily very clear answers. And that is, okay, it's of course a cluster of questions, as happens with these sorts of things, but let me try and be brief and precise enough to make it meaningful. So on the one hand, most of the thinkers that we are engaging with here posit some sort of pastness of mythology, right? And this is perhaps clearest the further back you go. In someone like Schelling, mythology is very clearly the world before monotheism came onto the scene. And because of this also, particularly Christianity becomes not just a move in religious history, but Christianity becomes an essential part of the genealogy of modernity. And for people like Hegel and Schelling, you can say modernity begins with Christianity, which is a bit early, perhaps, for some people, but there we are. At the same time, another question we're all concerned with is somehow the persistence of myth. That if on the one hand, mythology is characterized by a certain pastness, we are also all keen to emphasize that it's been written off too easily and quickly, that there's persistence of the mythological for better or for worse. And then the question becomes how something like a genealogy of modernity and the persistence of myth within that story can be brought together in a meaningful way. I hope to say one or two small things about that in the case of Schelling tomorrow, but I find it a very difficult question to answer from within his own work. Blumenberg, on the other hand, is of course someone who is very much interested in something like the genealogy of modernity, and not merely on the basis of a predetermined speculative model of world history, but something much more concretely invested in historical texts and their evolution. So, is there anything that you can say to help us orient as we go further in this conference on how to think together the pastness yet persistence of myth and the genealogy and the ongoing project of modernity at the same time? Just tiny little questions for you to sprinkle a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And in fact, as you said, Blumenberg, you asked me, I know, to step away from Blumenberg, and I will try to do that, but I'll start here with Blumenberg. It's a central part of his account of myth that what he calls work on myth, which is the reception of myth, continues the work of myth. So it's doing the same work, and that the cause of the need for such reception, for continuing the work of myth, has to do with a certain ineliminable indefiniteness in the human experience of the world. This has led to accusations that he is essentialist with respect to human nature, that he, which I don't know about, but that because there is necessarily in the human experience of the world a certain kind of indefiniteness, and that indefiniteness makes let's say that it arises in moments of more abrupt historical change. There is a continued need to deal with that indefiniteness, and that myth is a good tool for dealing with that indefiniteness. And so he tells the genealogy of modernity, if you will, as a history in which mythical elements continue to be taken up in each change. So with, you know, when Christianity is taking over from the antique world, there are definitely elements of mythical thinking that are taken up even in the process of dogmatization. There is, one could even say, in the, you know, beginning of the modern age, the sort of 0 point turn of modernity, abandoning everything that came before us, has a kind of mythical function. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all. It seems to me that the pastness of mythology in Blumenberg's account is a feature, in a way, of the way it was formed, that because it was formed over such a long, vast period of time in account, there's something of that passage through time that becomes a part of myth. And it's a formal part of myth that is felt in its patterns. And so that pastness is what makes it appealing as a way of dealing with things in the present. I don't know that that's answering your question at all, but those are the sort of thoughts that first come to mind.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to somehow answer some of the main questions of the conference here. Brian, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for your, can you hear me? This work?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for your talk. I'm actually going to mention, by the way, just tomorrow a little bit about Blumenberg too. So, but I was wondering, maybe something similar or along the same lines as what Martijn was asking. And maybe this can help, I don't know, but you mentioned, not really sure how it fit in, maybe it was in passing, but the link between evolution, human evolution, and the evolution of myth, of course, how those go together, and maybe a evolutionary role. I guess sometimes it can be helpful just to, if you could say whether you think what Blumenberg has to say, would you characterize it as anti-Darwinian in that regard? Or even more specifically, whether work on myth now, in the present, does that have an evolutionary role? I mean, can we think about evolution in the present? And can we think if myth, in the way he characterizes it, could in some way, excuse me, could in some way contribute to something like that? That might just maybe put a finer point on that same kind of question.
Right. Yes, so he refers to his account of the formation of myth as Darwinism in the area of words, in the realm of words, something like that. So it's Darwinist with respect to, or Darwinian with respect to myth, and I guess anti-Darwinian with respect to human evolution, insofar as human culture is able to protect humans from the pressures of selection. And so it's an account wherein biological adaptation seems to stop where culture begins.
Yeah, you might, yes, like biological selection. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, right. So then the second question, do I think myth could serve a kind of evolutionary purpose in the present? I think that's a good question. Do you,
Or maybe it's something more like, can you perceive or a continuity? Maybe it's easier to speak about evolution in any sense in the past, right? Pastness, but whether there's that kind of continuity with the present, and we could connect it perhaps with other things too, but with the role of myth, with work on myth as that is ongoing, you know, in terms of its kind of pragmatic functions as you were describing.
Yeah, here's the reason for my hesitation. I think it's in the introduction to Paradigms for a Metaphorology. Blumenberg says about metaphor that a robust metaphorology prevents someone from being able to use metaphors productive, or so metaphor cannot serve the same purpose for someone who has a robust metaphorology that it can for someone who does not. It can't serve the same kind of pre-theoretical cognitive purpose. And it makes me wonder if having a robust theory of myth by analogy would prevent people from being able to use myth in the same way. Now, my paper that I just read would seem to suggest quite the opposite, right? Because Blumenberg's using myth for the sake of this theoretical work. But to what degree, and I don't know. There's something that's very cagey in work on myth when it comes to deliberate uses of myth for anything other than survival. He has this quote that that myth provides for survival. For human happiness, it has no images. And further, and I think I might have mentioned this too in the paper, he seems to accord a really special status to the inherited ancient myths and seems very suspicious. I mean, he does talk about art myths and philosophical myths, but he seems kind of suspicious about the attempt to put to use myths that have not been inherited. He seems to, again, in a very cagey way, be suspicious about that. Again, all of this is either leading up to an answer to your question or avoiding it, and I can't decide which.
Good, but thank you.
It's funny. I tend to think, just to really quickly, I tend to think of the use of myth as he conceives of it to be, you know, different in different historical situations. It has to do with dealing with change and is unrepeatable in that way. And it's hard for me to take the leap from thinking of it that way to an idea of evolution, which I guess isn't necessarily progressive towards some end, but makes, you know, I don't know if his understanding of history is compatible with the notion of evolution. I don't know. I feel like I'm walking in circles. I think it's a very good question, though. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions before we sign off for this afternoon, for tonight? I have a list of questions, but I'll have to ask you later, Nate, because I'm getting pretty sleepy.
I can't wait.
As we approach 11 p.m. here.
Yes.
So, yeah, thanks everyone again for a good day of talks and discussion. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. And we'll be starting at 4 p.m. Let me just note that there's a change for the schedule for tomorrow. This is our last day. One of our speakers could not, had to cancel. And so that's Mentos. So Brian, you're okay with presenting at 9 p.m. or 9 a.m. I guess your time. Is it that's okay for you still? Can move you up.
Yeah, that's fine. That's 8. Yeah. That's
Oh,
fine.
right. Okay. So we'll finish early tomorrow. We'll finish at 9:45 p.m. Hong Kong time. Okay. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks a lot for attending all the talks and the discussions and everything. And see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.